Please open your Bibles to Joshua 23 and 24. This is one of my favorite parts of the Bible. Joshua 23 and 24. Glad that each of you are here. This is our last session on Joshua. I decided not to go through the review. I think we can just jump into Judges. And there is a workbook, a study of Judges and Ruth, that I have for you. And we'll look at Lesson 1, Intro, and Chapter 1 next week. And these are on the back table. So I didn't want to pass them out now because you're tempted to look through it, as I would be tempted to do. And I want you to stay tuned to Joshua until we're ready to move on. So before you leave, please remember to pick up your workbook, okay? My thanks to Brent Bader for helping me get these run off and printed in a professional manner. They look really nice. So come on in, Kim. Jan Bader just told me that her daughter, Jana, that her daughter, I guess I should have just said Jan's grandchild's husband, Colin Andries, several weeks ago was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And so he's had a mass in his chest and is going under treatment for that. And they also have a little baby, Hanson, is that right? Hudson, that has a respiratory issue and they had to take him to the hospital. Is that right? So we need to remember them. I'm sure that's a concern. We're having issues with getting Gale home from Florida, another hurricane, tropical storm. They're expecting it to be a Cat 1. It's somewhat north of Tampa, but flights are pretty much, canceled, or we expect them to be canceled. So we just went ahead and rescheduled her to come home on Saturday. So that's what's going on with Gale. And I got a note from Brent Bader and from Jim Bruins that they'll be watching online. Jim's dealing with a cough, and Brett said he's not feeling very well. I don't know if that has anything to do with the elections or not, but Mike Simon is still struggling, of course, with the fact that this lymphoma that he has been growing somewhat rapidly after being more in remission up until recently, so we certainly need to remember Mike in our prayers. Ellie Kirkpatrick, same issue. And so anybody else have any other prayer requests that we need to mention before we begin? Anything else on anybody's heart? Okay. Josh Ralston, would you please lead our minds in prayer, please? Thank you. Okay, thank you, Josh. All right, hopefully we can have some good discussion tonight. This is the last two chapters of the book. Joshua ends very similarly to the way that Deuteronomy ends. So they both have these farewell speeches at the end. And chapter 23, he calls the leaders together. 23 and verse 2, Joshua called all Israel for their elders and their heads and their judges and their officers and said unto them, I am old and well stricken in years. And so he goes on and talks specifically to sort of the heads of state and the leaders of the different tribes. It would be like some elders meeting first with the elders and the deacons and the Bible class teachers and some of that kind of core group, and then later on he makes an address to the whole church kind of thing. So obviously he first wants to address the leaders. And then in chapter 24, it says, and Joshua gathered after he's done admonishing and addressing the leaders, all the tribes of Israel to Shechem. And he called for the elders and their judges and for their officers, and they presented themselves before God. So he still got the leaders there, but he wants everybody to hear it now. So that's important to understand that distinction as we get into this. Now, let's do a little background. Joshua is one of my favorite characters. Remember, Joshua is Hebrew for what? Jesus. Jesus is Aramaic. Joshua is Hebrew. So Joshua is a type of Christ, a wonderful example. His name literally in the Hebrew means Jehovah saves. And when we think about Joshua, there's three primary characteristics that come to mind. What do we first know about Joshua? What do we first think of him as being? Yeah, he's the faithful spy, and because he's the faithful spy, he's the survivor. So that kind of makes it easy to remember. All these things start with an S. He's the survivor, and then he is the one that is the protege of Moses, and Moses passes the baton on to him. And of course, he's the one that leads them in the conquest. So you also think about Joshua, particularly in regards to Jericho and all these 31 battles. He's the general, the courageous general that leads them in battle. God tells him to be faithful and to be courageous and to not be afraid, and then he admonishes the people to be faithful and courageous and not be afraid as well. And here, he's not so much as well known for this as I think he should be. The third thing we need to think about when we think about Joshua is he is the shepherd. He is the caring, older statesman. And that's really, he's not speaking to them here as a general. And he's not a spy. And of course, they're long out of the wilderness. But talk about somebody that has a life of faithfulness and a life of service. And obviously, as he's getting older, to say the least, how old is he, later on when it talks about he dies? Yeah, he's 110, just 10 years shy of Moses. We're not sure exactly how old he was when he did this, but he knows that his time is coming. And so this is kind of an emotional thing. He's been with these people, wandered with them, kind of bearing their sin because they had to wander because of these other people's faithlessness. And he suffered with them there in the wilderness through no fault of his own. But he was there with them throughout all this. And all these other people died off. And the only two really old men that are left in Israel are Joshua and Caleb. We talked about Caleb as well in an earlier study of Joshua. So he's the survivor, he's the soldier, and now he's this caring older statesman. And so why is he calling first the leaders and then the nation together? What does he say in verse 1 and then again in verse 2? Somebody want to read that? Joshua 23 and verse 1. Go ahead. Anil?
A long time afterward, when the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their surrounding enemies, and Joshua was old and well advanced in years, Joshua summoned all Israel, its leaders and heads, its judges and officers, and said to them, I am now old and well advanced in years.
Okay, yeah. So, he knows he doesn't have much time left. And so he's close to death. It's kind of this moving sort of time, like when Jacob is on his deathbed and he calls his family and all these 12, sons together, and he gives them his advice and his fatherly patriarchal blessing. So he's got some things he wants to say. And he's obviously concerned about what's going to happen after I'm gone. He's concerned about the next generation. He's concerned about the future. I hear people all the time talk about they're concerned about our country and the direction it's going and the problems we're having at so many levels. And people say, well, I'm just especially concerned for my kids and grandkids. What's it going to be like for them? If things don't get turned around. And so he's concerned about his prodigy. He's concerned about the nation. And he recognizes that this situation here is going to be very unusual because Moses passed it on to Joshua, and Joshua is not going to pass it on to one particular individual. Because at this point, they're going to have a loose tribal confederacy without one national government. They're not going to even have a capital city until David in Jerusalem. So this time, they're not supposed to have a king. And so God is just giving them tremendous freedom, and each tribe is going to have their own leadership, but there's not going to be one person that everybody looks to like they had during the time of Moses and Joshua. So no wonder he's calling together all the leaders of all the tribes and all these people, because in their own little localities, they're all going to have to be responsible to carry on the baton of faith and to carry on this courageous, faithful service. And as we mentioned earlier, to finish the job and to be diligent to continue to drive out these wicked people that are all around them. And so this is really moving. And wouldn't it be something to hear the trumpets blown? That's the way they'd call people to these assemblies. And what's the occasion? Joshua wants to talk to us. He's got something to say to us. He's still alive, but he's old and well stricken in years, and he wants to speak to us. And so we're going to talk about why he chooses the place that he does to give this address. But, he's got to be in a place where everybody can hear him, because they didn't have microphones back then. And this whole part here, when you kind of get the historical background, is really, really moving. Now, the question is, are there some other examples, like in the New Testament, where we have some inspired writers that specifically indicate they're concerned about the future and future generations and the future of local churches? What's that? Yeah, well known. Of course, Paul calls the elders at Ephesus over at Miletus because he doesn't think he's going to see them again. And he didn't want to get stuck in Ephesus, so he says, meet me over here on the beach kind of thing. And what is he concerned about? What does he tell those elders? A lot of different things and great admonitions, but he warns them about what? Yeah, about the future, and that there's going to be some that are going to come from your own midst. I think that's some of the Ephesian elders may turn, and you're going to have to deal with that. He says they're going to be grievous wolves in sheep clothing. They're going to try to take you away, and be aware and be careful and be faithful, because I'm concerned about your future. And Peter in 2 Peter 1 and verse 12 talks about, I'm going to bring these things into your remembrance. Not that you don't already know them, but these are really important and you need to remember them, because I want you to continue to be established in the truth. And the idea there is, I think you're established now, but don't forget these principles, because you need to hang on to them in the future. Because we're supposed to be faithful unto death, Revelation 2 and verse 10. Then we receive the crown of life. It says of David that he served God in his own generation. He fulfilled his purpose in his own generation. And that's really the only generation that we can specifically serve is, during our lifetime, the people we can touch. But hopefully we can touch those people, especially younger people, in a way that they will continue the light of faith and the light of truth and spread it in a world of darkness and not fall away. Of course, one of the things that makes this so sad, since we know the future of Israel, and so moving in many ways, is his concerns about this are really valid, aren't they? Because what happens after the people that forget Joshua are dead? I don't think I phrased that right. Sorry, let me rephrase that. What happens to after there's a generation of people that didn't know Joshua and didn't? Yeah, they're going to be. They're not going to listen to these admonitions. They're going to drift and eventually go into apostasy, and that's what happens with the book of Judges. And about every 70 or 80 years, the same thing happens again and again. Why? Because they don't remember their history, and the baton of faith is not successfully passed on to the next generation. So it's like Moses and Joshua both knew this was very likely to happen and was just begging them, don't let it happen. So the parents, I think, got the message. The wilderness generation got the message. And we had this example in Joshua 22 where they're really conscientious, and they thought that some of the tribes, Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, had already built some altar that they thought, was not authorized and was an altar to another god. And so they're ready to defend the truth. So they've got that initial commitment. But sadly, they're not going to keep it. But Joshua is hoping for the best here, and he wants to do what he can to call these people to faithfulness. So, how does he begin his address? What does he do first? He starts with a historical overview. It's real brief, but no doubt he starts with reminding them about their past. Again, is history important? Absolutely. And who else began his address this way? Moses. I think the first 4 chapters of Moses is basically a historical survey to these people that just finished the wilderness wanderings, and then he goes back all the way to Egypt and all the way back to their forefathers, and he reminds them of their roots, and he doesn't want them to forget, because it gives you a sense of purpose and understanding. Those who go the furthest forward are the ones that are willing to go first the furthest backwards and remember where we've come from and remember our history. And so with that in mind, let's look at what he says here in Joshua 23, verses 3 and 4. Somebody have that would like to read. Okay, Sean? Why don't you wait till the microphone comes so the folks online can hear it.
And you have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all the nations for your sake. For it is the Lord your God who has fought for you. Behold, I have allotted to you as an inheritance for your tribes those nations that remain, along with all the nations that I have already cut off, from the Jordan to the great sea in the west.
Okay, so what are the themes here that he's developing in this little survey and in the verses that follow? First thing he reminds them, though he's been their leader and he's been the one that has led them to success after success after success, at least in battle, and he's been personally exemplary as an individual of faith, but what does he want the people to remember first? Yes, yeah. God is the one that's been faithful. I'm just his servant. This is so important. As a nation, the United States doesn't have a big battle and issues like monarchies often do when the king or the monarch dies. Who's going to be the next monarch? And oftentimes, this happened in Roman history frequently with the problem with the Caesars and, all that kind of system. But our forefathers wisely wanted us to be a people that's not putting so much focus and attention on one person, In fact, the president has to answer to other branches of government, and there's all these checks and balances, which was very wise. But they wanted us to be a people of law, and they wanted us all to commit to the principles in our Constitution and in the Bill of Rights. So that even though presidents come and go, everybody still has to take a pledge to defend the Constitution and the enemies to the Constitution, both foreign and domestic. That was a rather unique thing in 1776. And if people can maintain an allegiance to these principles, then workers, leaders come and go, but the principles live on. And likewise, in a local church, it ought not to be primarily some sort of personality-driven kind of a deal. And though our shepherds and deacons and other leaders are very important, as they get older and pass from the scene, hopefully there's other people that grow up and follow the same word and are faithful to the same Lord, so the church can continue on with stability because we're all faithful first and foremost to Jesus and to his word, rather than putting too much emphasis just on the servant. Put it on the Savior. And that's why we have to be studying God's word like we are, and making sure we lay it up on our hearts and spend time memorizing it and reflecting upon it, because that's the thing that gives us loyalty and faithfulness. And at the end of all of this, there's going to be a renewal of the covenant where the people write their names right there at the copy of the covenant and commit once again to the law and to Jehovah. So Joshua is very humble here. And he's, as we said, concerned, to have led the nation to all these victories and to work so hard to be the right servant and to help these people be what they are supposed to be, and this chosen people and that are separate and set apart for God's service, and then to have it all thrown away by a future generation that doesn't appreciate it and doesn't follow. What a waste that is. Thomas Paine said, that which comes too easily is esteemed too lightly. And I think that's the problem we often have today. The lack of patriotism we have today is often because people just grow up with all these liberties and all these rights and all these privileges, and it's all they've ever known, and they didn't have to fight for them, and oftentimes you don't really appreciate them like those who really shed blood for them. And so same thing is true, I think, here in Israel, and same thing is true in spiritual Israel. So he always is going to focus in on Jehovah, Jehovah, Jehovah. Let's put the emphasis on God, not on any human being. And he also wants to give them promise and challenge for the future. Verse 5, he says, "And Jehovah your God, he will thrust these remaining nations from before you. He will drive them out of your sight, and you shall possess their land as Jehovah your God spake unto you." So even though the major battles have been won and fought, he's reminding them there's still work to be done. And the same God that has given us all this care in the wilderness, and the same God that gave us victory during the conquest, if you are going to be faithful to him, he will continue to be faithful to you. But then he warns them, if you turn away from God and you're not faithful to him, not only will he not continue to bless you, he will curse you. And just as God is faithful to do the good things for us when we're faithful to him, he is faithful to go through with what he has said when there are consequences to turning your back on him and being disloyal. So he's really stressing, don't think just because of the Abrahamic promise and just because God is done all these things for you, that you can just do whatever you want and it doesn't matter, you're going to always be blessed. Kind of like a once saved, always saved mentality. The land promise is given upon the condition of faithfulness. And he's going to warn them here that if you turn away and bow down to idols and you're not faithful and you're no longer a holy people, then this land is going to be taken away from you. And that's exactly what's going to happen. Now, the irony of this is, he tells this group of people, and how many centuries is it going to take for Israel to finally be taken into captivity? About what time frame are we looking at historically here? Yeah, about 14. Well, this would, the conquest is thought to be about 1425. This is many years later, but, somewhere around maybe 1475 or something. And then Samaria fell 722 BC, and about 150 years later, Jerusalem and the temple and the city will be completely destroyed. 532, I think? 605 is when it starts, and then it goes down. There's different phases of it. But think about the centuries. Why do you think it's going to take hundreds and hundreds of years for this to come to pass? What does that say about God? Yeah, he's long-suffering, and there are some good kings, at least in Judah, and he is amazingly long-suffering. And I think one of the problems is that the people who have some idea of their history, this has been centuries and we're still here. And we're not being faithful, but we're still here. So I think people often misunderstand God's patience and desire that people will repent, and giving people time to repent, with God's impotence, that somehow or other he's not going to follow through with what he said on the bad side. And so sometimes God takes a long time to bring about the eventual, you reap what you sow on both ends. Think about it. We're all waiting for Jesus to return. Been 2,000 years. Why is he taking so long? Not desirous that anyone perish, but that everyone come to salvation. So, God is faithful and deserves the credit. He gives them a promise for the future. And then in verses 6 through 16, he talks about their responsibility for the present in order to secure this good future. And then throughout this, there's this warning and challenge to be faithful. Let's look at this section here, and beginning at verse 6, where he shifts over and he starts talking about your responsibility. Remember, these are the leaders. It says, therefore, be ye very courageous. You heard that before? That's what Josh said in his prayer, isn't it? Joshua chapter 1, that's the way God first addressed Joshua and the people. Be ye courageous, be not afraid. Maintain this courage to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, not just some of it, but all of it, that ye turn not aside from the right to the left. Don't get distracted by all these other temptations and all these material possessions you have now that you didn't have before. You stay focused and stay faithful. And you come not among these nations. What nations is he talking about? Yeah, the 7 nations that are repeated over and over again that Moses delineated in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 and 2, as these nations that their wickedness has been made full and they deserve to be wiped out. And remember, these aren't just people that are in a land and their only sin is they possess a land that you covet. No. These are people that are being vomited out in a national judgment because they are just guilty of all types of terrible behaviors, passing their children through the fire, animal sacrifices, unbelievable sexual immorality, including bestiality. There's a whole list of all these sins of these nations. So these people are corrupt, and they just need to be wiped out. They're that evil. Yes, Mark.
Notice in verse 7, when he's giving these warnings, he says, don't associate with the nations that remain among you. Don't even mention the name of their gods. I found that really powerful. They warned that warning.
Yeah, I did too. In fact, one of the questions I'm going to bring up later, you're reading my notes, is this: why would he say that? And we'll get into that in just a minute. Thank you, Mark, because that struck me as well. Of course, throughout chapter 23 and chapter 24, verse 25 is probably the most famous and maybe the most important part of this section. Good set of verses to memorize here. Someone like to read Joshua 24:15 as he challenges these people to make the right choices. Okay.
24:25.
It's supposed to be 24:15. Do I have the wrong verse? Okay. It should be, I think. Yeah, it should be 15. Sorry about that.
If it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord.
Yeah, a lot of us just quote that last phrase. But the context here is in this farewell address to the nation. Now, I think there's 4 words that just really jump out to me, and 4 ideas here that we need to make sure that we get. And I want to go ahead and do it here at the very beginning so we don't wind up rushing here at the end and miss one of the most important parts. First, he says, choose you this day whom you will serve. So all those people in the sound of his voice, he's challenging each of them. You make a commitment to serve Jehovah. It's got to be something personal. What does 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10 say? When we stand before God, how do we stand before him? He says, when you stand before the judgment bar of Christ, everyone's going to be judged based on what they did in the body, whether it be good or whether it be evil. You don't stand as a family unit. You don't even stand as a congregation. Everybody has to give an individual accounting to God in judgment. And so just because you're in a good church or you think you're in the right church, that's going to be some sort of wagon that's going to take you all on to heaven. Well, I think it's important that you choose a church that worships faithfully, but ultimately every individual is going to have to give an account for their own life. So he says, choose you this day whom you will serve. And then he makes them make this commitment that you purposefully will not choose anything else. Don't choose these other gods. Don't take these other roads. Stay on the road of faithfulness and don't swerve to the right or to the left, because the biggest problem that we all have in our lives is the tendency to drift. So he says, choose personally, choose purposefully, because God demands loyalty. And, the focus here is on idols, and oftentimes we think, well, that's not a problem with me. I would never think about bowing down before a golden calf or a big Buddha statue or something like that. But the New Testament, in 1 John 5, verse 21, the very end of John's epistle, he says, little children, do what? Yeah, keep yourself from idols. Paul says, flee idolatry. So he's not talking about idols of stone and wood and brass and that kind of thing, though that was a problem in the Roman world, of course. I think to these Christians, he's saying anything that what? Yeah, that takes first place in your life is an idol. So when we think about this, we have to deal with all types of idolatry all around us, because there's so many things that can take first place. What do you purpose personally in your heart? And then it has to be done persistently. He's not telling them just to choose now, but he's looking to the future. And he says you have to continually be faithful, choose now, purposefully, and instill that in your children as well so they don't lose the land that I just worked so hard and fought so long that we could have. So you choose personally, purposefully, persistently. What did Jesus say about taking up our cross? How often do we do that? Sure, he didn't say just right about the time after you're baptized? No, he says right after you become a disciple, he says you take up your cross daily and follow me. 1 Corinthians 15:31, I die daily. I hear Elijah quote that verse a lot. Is Elijah sick tonight? I see. Well, tell him we missed him. All right, so we have to do it personally, purposefully, persistently. And in this case, he's got the whole nation out there. And publicly, he says, for me and my house, we're going to continue to serve Jehovah. What about you? And then he wants them to make a public commitment. What did Jesus say in Matthew 12 and verse 30? Someone like to read that? He's warning his disciples. Is there any secret service that he wants? Whoever gets to it first, just raise your hand. Okay, go ahead, Mark.
Matthew 12, verse 30. He who is not with me is against me, and he who does not gather with me scatters.
Okay, so again, you've got to make a decision. And Jesus says that, that if you confess me before men, I will also confess you before my Father which is in heaven. If you deny me before men, I'll deny you before my Father which is in heaven. And there's something very important about a public confession and not being ashamed. He says, if you are ashamed of me on the earth before men, I'll be ashamed of you to confess your name before the Heavenly Father. And so we've got to have that sense of a willingness to take a stand. And this whole thing is done publicly. And it must not be ashamed. It's not appropriate to, have your dimmer switch on every time you're around somebody that's of the world and you think they'll look down upon you for being a Christian. So, personally, purposefully, persistently, publicly. That's what we get out of this. And I've had for many years these little notes in the margin of my Bible. Makes a good little sermonette, don't you think? And I wanted you guys to kind of think that through. So, Joshua's primary message to the elders can be outlined in 4 main points. So, in verse 3, he says, you have witnessed all that God has done to the nations for your benefit. Verse 4, you have been given as an inheritance this land from the Jordan to the sea. God will drive out those nations that remain as he promised. But you have to be faithful. Therefore, keep the whole law. All right, so this goes back to something that Mark noticed that I did as well. So why did he tell them not to even mention the names of the foreign gods? Isn't that interesting? Go ahead, Sean.
He doesn't want them to be interested in the history of those gods and how the people served them and what they went about to do. So he just wanted it to be driven out completely so that there was just no even temptation to serve them.
It's interesting. I have some friends, the Hafers, Jack and Ann Hafer. And they've got a neat little place in Salem where they actually get little baby steer, and then they raise the steer up, and then at the appropriate time, they have fresh meat. And so you're in their yard, and these big steers come up, and Ann goes, it's kind of hard because you kind of feel bad they're going to be my dinner one day. So no, these are not our pets, and we don't name them. You name a pet, you don't name somebody that you're raising to slaughter. And I said, yeah, I can get that. And so he says, don't even mention their name. How does this relate? Well, one of the things that my family memorized many years ago that I've shared with you before is a little saying known as watch. Watch your thoughts, they become your words. Watch your words, they'll become your actions. Watch your actions, they'll become your character. Watch your character, that becomes your destiny. But it all starts back with thoughts. And sometimes when my kids were wanting to see movies that we thought had bad language in them, they go, oh, what's the big deal? All our friends are seeing it, you know. And I'd say, you know what the big deal is, to expose yourself to all that profanity and those things. Watch your thoughts, and then they just finish it off for me. I go, there's certain things you want to nip in the bud and not defile your spirit. You kids are innocent, and we want to maintain a certain measure of innocence. You'll be in the adult world and have to be exposed to all that stuff soon enough. But right now, just enjoy your childhood innocence. And it's our job to protect you from pollution. So he says, don't name them. Don't even mention their name, because when you think about someone like that, it gets into your thoughts and it starts that process. Yes, Les.
It seems here in verse 7 to me that God knows they're not going to get rid of all the people.
Well, he knows the future. And so he's warning them and giving them a chance to do the right thing. Yeah, absolutely. And he's going to tell them in very no uncertain terms the consequences of your not keeping these people, these wicked people, just stay away from them. It's similar to Deuteronomy 18 and verse 10, where it talks about the occult and all these, enchanters and augury. And there's a whole paragraph there that deals with the 9 different types of devil worship. And he says, these things are an abomination unto God. And he says, you shouldn't have anything to do with them. Don't associate with anyone who does. Yes, same idea. Go ahead.
It's interesting, God says there, don't even take their names. But in the New Testament, when it comes to the matter of food sacrificing to idols, he would say, if anybody who is new believer, if he gets offended or something, don't take it, but otherwise take it, because they're just idols, So in the New Testament, he gives us more liberty, but still you need to check.
Yeah, and of course, on the other side of that, what are we supposed to be doing all the time? Calling upon what? The name of the Lord, right? And there's all these different special names for God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit and all these things that will hopefully draw us closer to Him. So I agree, Mark. That was a very good observation about how careful they needed to be. And Ephesians 5 and verse 12 says that there are some things that are done in secret that are not even, it's shameful to even speak about them. Years ago, I did a series at North Street where I used to preach on the occult. It was in the news a lot. And so as a part of my research for that, I actually purchased the Satanic Bible. I wanted to look at the original source and see exactly what they were saying. And reading that book just gave me nightmares. I mean, it was just, I was just doing it intellectually, right? And I finally just had to stop. I said, this is just bad news, because it was entering into my thoughts and troubling my spirit. There are some things that are so bad, you shouldn't speak of them, because when you speak of them, then you bring those to the mind of others. And there's some things that are so bad, you just need to recognize them when you see them and just not fill your mind up with them, even to just intellectually learn about them. I mean, there's a curiosity, but we just need to have enough faith to know, I want to stay on the straight and narrow, and I don't want to get over into that. And that's what he's trying to tell these people. And I just think it's fascinating. So what admonition does he then give them in verses 11 through 13 after he goes through this? Someone like to read that? Larry, you have that?
So take diligent heed to yourselves to love the Lord your God. For if you ever go back and cling to the rest of these nations, these which remain among you, and intermarry with them, so that you are associate with them, and they with you.
So, what is he warning them about? You be diligent to love the Lord. You know, first he says, don't even mention the name of their gods, and, you know, don't let them dwell among you. You know, dispossess them. And by all means, don't marry them. That's going to be Solomon's downfall. I just don't understand how somebody who's really committed to going to heaven would have any interest in marrying somebody that doesn't care about going to heaven with them. I mean, why in the world would anybody do that? And one of the things that's really going to bring them down is the tendency that the prophets are going to deal with over and over and over again. He's going to condemn them for not only dwelling among the people, but making these people... You know, if somebody's father is the devil, you know, then when you marry someone whose father is the devil, that you make the devil one of your in-laws. Is that a very good idea? He says, if you do not do this, then know for certain that God will no longer push these people out, and they will become the source of your downfall. They will be the cause of the demise of Israel. They're going to be traps to you, and they're going to be thorns, not just in your side, but in your eyes. I don't know about you, but that's worse to me than a thorn in your side. And so these people represent sin. So is sin often just the devil's trap? It's just like he leads you over here to be okay. He's just waiting to get you entrapped and entangled in sin. And it takes you further than you want to go and keeps you longer than you want to stay. And so he warns them. And this generation that heard this, pretty much they were faithful. But again, the problem is their children didn't get it. All right. So what is the F then argument that he closes with in 14b to 16? He says, God kept all of the good promises that he made to you, not allowing even one to fail, fulfilling every vow. Then you can be certain that he will also keep all the promises of punishment, bringing catastrophic things upon the nation until it is completely destroyed. So you already have witnessed the kind of God we serve. He keeps his word. And part of his word is if you turn away from him, you're going to have to deal with him. And you're going to be vomited out of the land just like these other wicked people were vomited out of the land. That's why later on when you study the Kings, it makes reference back to how wicked the children of Israel had gotten and how they did things like the Canaanites who originally dwelt in the land did. As bad as the Canaanites. And then under the time of Manasseh, it says they were worse than the Canaanites. So that was the end. That's when God said, I'm going to have to take you into captivity. So he's telling them this right up front. Twice in chapter 23, Joshua refers to clinging to something. Where are they found? To what does he speak of clinging? What does this verb mean? What does this teach us today? Well, we just had someone read the first most important reference to it. He says, cling unto the Lord your God. And they must not cling to the remnant of these nations. The word means to grasp closely as for dear life. same as Acts 11, 24 and 25, when Barnabas visits the churches that had been established and he admonishes them to cleave unto the Lord, this good man who was filled with the Holy Spirit. Just as Jesus said that no man can serve two masters, it's not possible to stand with one foot in the camp of God and one in the camp of Satan. Or will cling to the one or the other, even though some claim that they do not serve anyone. Further, if we're not clinging to God, then we are clinging to Satan. Either you're for me or against me, is what Jesus said. Where does the gathering of 24:1 take place? Why do you think Joshua chose this location? So what does it say in 24 and verse 1? All right, they went to Shechem. Now, why do you think they went to Shechem? Because earlier in 18 and verse 1, they went to Shiloh at the tent of meeting. Because where's the tabernacle? In Shiloh. So why didn't they meet at the tabernacle? What did they have to have? He's going to address the whole nation? Yeah. They had to have, millions of people here, folks. How are you going to hear Joshua's speech? Instead of bringing the people together where the tabernacle is located, Joshua calls the people together at Shechem, Mount Ebal and Gerizim. The place held a significant historical place in the hearts of the Israelites. So he's going to ask them at the end to recommit to the covenant as a people. Their servants, their little ones, everyone that is present. When's the last time we read about them doing this? Right in the middle of the conquest, right after Jericho. Remember, they walk up there, made the 8-mile walk right in the middle of a war and did this, and they're supposed to do this every 7 years. So I'm assuming that they were faithful after that first incident that's recorded to continue to do this, because they were supposed to meet every 7 years as a nation. But this time, there's a special meeting that Joshua is calling as he thinks this would be my last chance, because he's an old man. So this is the first and continual reaffirmation of the covenant where they had the first blessings and cursings. And as I said, great acoustics. And remember, the law was written there, like in the stones on the altar. So that they're going to make reference to that at the end of this study. How would you summarize the point that God, through Joshua, is making in 24:3 through 13? Well, let's go ahead. Let's start at verse 2 of Joshua 24. And Joshua said unto all the people, Thus saith Jehovah, the God of Israel, your fathers dwelt of old time beyond the river, even Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. Let me just make a little side point. We always talk about Abram as being the father of the faithful, and he was and is. But he wasn't raised by good godly parents that taught him about Jehovah. He was raised by an idolater. He came out of Ur of the Chaldees. He's a transition person. He's somebody who came out of negativity but chose on his own to do better than what he saw his parents do, which is hopefully a great example for all of us as we strive to be faithful. It says, I took your father Abraham from beyond the river and led them throughout all the land of Canaan and multiplied his seed and gave him Isaac. And I gave unto Isaac Jacob and Esau, and I gave unto Esau Mount Seir to possess it. And Jacob and his children went down into Egypt, and I sent Moses and Aaron. Here we go, another historical survey. And I plagued Egypt, and I brought you out. Verse 6, and I brought your fathers out of Egypt, and you came into the sea, and the Egyptians pursued after your fathers with chariots and horsemen into the Red Sea. When they cried out unto Jehovah, he put darkness between you and the Egyptians through the pillar of cloud, and brought the sea upon them, and they covered them, and your eyes saw what I did in Egypt. In other words, many of you lived through this. And ye dwelt in the wilderness many days. And I brought you into the land of the Amorites that dwelt among the Jordan, and they fought with you. And I gave them into your hand, and ye possessed their land, and I destroyed them from before you. Then Balak, the son of Zippor, king of Moab, arose and fought against Israel, and he sent and called Balaam, the son of Beor, to curse you. But I would not hearken unto Balaam, therefore he blessed you still. So I delivered you out of his hand, and you went over the Jordan and came into Jericho, and the men of Jericho fought against you. And then he mentions these 7 nations again. the Amorite, the Pezerite, the Hivite, etc. And I delivered them into your hand. And I sent the hornets before you, which drove them out from before you, even the 2 kings of the Amorites, not with thy sword. So here's this example of God manipulating nature so that they could be used as agents of war and instruments in the battles. And there's 2 other places, by the way, Exodus 23, 28, Deuteronomy 7:20, where it talks about God's going to send these hornets out. And 1 man of you shall chase 1,000. Remember another occasion, he had the storm clouds and the hailstones that were so large that kind of had this kind of old-fashioned carpet bombing with these, he's using nature. Well, he's the creator. And he also uses nature not just to punish these wicked people, but what's the biggest example in the Bible of God manipulating nature to bring about punishment? Yeah, the flood, absolutely. And lots of times he's the one that's behind famines to try to get people's attention as well. So this is supposed to take us through verse 13. And he says, and I gave you a land whereupon thou hast not labored, and cities which you built not, and you dwell therein, of the vineyards and the olive yards which ye planted but did not eat. Boy, is that a pretty good deal? Especially for people who are used to living in tents, right? So you have this land only because of me. It could also be noted here that God has listed a few of the great deeds in accomplishing this promise to Abraham. Verse number 7 here. Do you think there remained a trace of idol worship within the ranks of the Israelites that listened to Joshua? Why or why not? If yes, how were they able to drive out the Canaanites? Well, he clearly is telling them, choose ye this day whom you're going to serve. And it certainly implies not just that he was worried about the gods of the Amorites, but also some of their traditional gods, maybe some that they still had taken with them from Egypt, maybe some that had been passed down from Jacob. Jacob had to admonish his own sons to put away idolatry from them. What? I mean, they were surrounded by idolatrous people, and they just constantly were tempted to do as everyone else around you does. It's called peer pressure. So yeah, they're still challenged with all of this. Almost certainly there was. Joshua indicates that it was so. God, through Ezekiel, says that at least some of them did. Then there's human nature, where a group of people are directed to do something and someone will not follow orders. Finally, there was the quick departure from God to other idols by the Israelites soon after Joshua's death. We are forced to conclude that even though the Israelites were not perfect in their adherence to the law, God still granted them entrance to the promised land, in part because he promised that he would do so. This should not, however, be construed as justification for a church to have just a little sin in its midst. He still requires us to purge the evil from among you, but obviously no one is perfect. So we say this nation is faithful. Generally, they were faithful, but there was still some people who needed to be told, get rid of this idolatry. With what two characteristics in 24:14 does Joshua say that they were to do to serve the Lord? I really love this verse. It reminds me of John 4 and verse 24. We're told to serve the Lord in spirit and in truth. What are we told here? Serve the Lord in sincerity and faithfulness. And also 1 Samuel 12. Only fear the Lord and serve him in truth with all your heart, for consider what great things God has done for you. Something that Gail recently taught the grandkids. But if you still do wickedly, both you and your king will be swept away. Serve him in truth. Serve him in sincerity. Consider the great things God has done for you. Once more, we will see another indication that the old law was not merely external, but also considered the inner man. Do it from the heart. Do it sincerely if you're going to make this commitment. Okay, I am out of time. let's go ahead and wrap up the last part of this next week, and then we'll jump into our study of Judges. And what are you supposed to pick up on the way out? Your new booklet, please. It's in the box. Yes? Okay. You may have seen on Realm that, can I say this publicly? Okay. That we're going to, it's not going to be a surprise. Can you